In 1918, 500 tons of gold vanished. Not stolen from a bank, not lost at sea. This was the British Empire's emergency fund, their insurance policy, their ace in the hole. And it disappeared in Russia during the chaos of a revolution. But here's the part that'll blow your mind. The gold didn't just vanish. Someone knew exactly where it went. They watched it happen. They documented every single bar. And then they stayed silent for decades. The British government called it the greatest robbery in history. Russia said they never touched it. And between those two lies, there's a truth so wild that even today, governments won't fully acknowledge what happened. I'm talking about $500 million in gold. Gone. And the trail leads to one of the most bizarre conspiracies of the 20th century. Stick with me because what I'm about to show you will change how you see international politics forever. Let's rewind to 1914. World War I just kicked off. Britain and Russia are allies. They're fighting Germany together. And Russia? They're getting absolutely pummeled on the Eastern Front. The Russian economy is collapsing. Their soldiers are starving. Revolution is brewing in the streets. So Britain does what allies do. They send help, but not just weapons or food. They send gold, actual gold bars, to keep Russia's economy from imploding completely. Between 1914 and 1917, Britain ships over 500 tons of gold to Russia. We're talking about 5,250 wooden crates, each one packed with solid gold bars. The deal was simple. Russia would hold this gold as collateral. When the war ended, Britain would get it back. Clean, simple, documented. But then 1917 happens. The Bolshevik Revolution erupts. The Tsar gets overthrown. Lenin takes power. And suddenly, Russia isn't just changing governments. They're rejecting everything the old system stood for, including debts, including agreements, including 500 tons of British gold sitting in their vaults. And here's where it gets really interesting. Most people think the gold just disappeared in the chaos. Revolutionary mobs, looting, confusion. But that's not what happened. The gold was under guard, 24/7. British officials were watching it like hawks. They knew exactly which vault it was in. They had the manifests, the serial numbers, everything. So when the gold went missing, it wasn't some accident. Someone made a decision. And that someone had the power to move 500 tons of gold without anyone stopping them. Now, Lenin's new government had a massive problem. They were broke. The entire Russian economy had collapsed. They needed funds desperately. And sitting right there in their vaults was the answer to all their problems. But here's the twist that almost no one talks about. Lenin didn't just steal the gold. He tried to negotiate with Britain first. Yeah, you heard that right. In early 1918, Soviet representatives approached British diplomats with a proposal. They said, "Look, we need this gold. Our people are starving, but we're willing to discuss terms." Britain's response? Absolutely not. They demanded the gold back. All of it. Immediately. No negotiations. The British government was furious. They just fought a war alongside Russia. They'd sent resources, soldiers, support. And now the new regime was holding their gold hostage. But Britain made a critical mistake here. They assumed they had leverage. They thought Lenin would cave to international pressure, that he'd care about diplomatic consequences. Lenin didn't care about any of that. He was building a completely new system, a system that rejected the old rules of international finance, the old debts, the old obligations, and he had 500 tons of leverage sitting in his vaults. So in the spring of 1918, Lenin made his move. The gold disappeared from the Russian state bank. British officials who'd been monitoring it were suddenly denied access. The vaults were sealed, and when they finally got someone to talk, they were told the gold had been relocated for security reasons. Security reasons. That was the official line. But here's what really happened. The gold was loaded onto trains, hundreds of crates, moving under armed guard, in the dead of night, and it was sent east, not to Moscow, not to St. Petersburg. It was heading to Siberia. Now, why would you send gold to Siberia, the most remote, inaccessible part of Russia? because Lenin wasn't just hiding it. He was using it. See, the Bolsheviks were fighting a civil war. The White Army, backed by Western powers, was trying to overthrow them, and Lenin needed to fund his Red Army. But he couldn't just walk into an international bank and exchange gold for cash. The entire Western world had cut off diplomatic relations with Soviet Russia. So he did something brilliant. He started trading the gold in Asia. Lenin's agents took British gold bars and moved them through China, Mongolia, and into Asian markets. They weren't selling the gold directly. That would have been too obvious, too easy to trace. Instead, they were using intermediaries, shell companies, criminal networks, anyone who could convert gold into currency without asking questions. And it worked. The British government knew something was happening. Their intelligence services picked up rumors, reports of Russian gold flooding Asian markets. But they couldn't prove it, because Lenin had done something genius. He'd melted down the gold bars, every single one. The British gold bars had serial numbers, stamps, markings that identified them as property of the British Empire. Lenin's government removed all of that. They melted the bars down and recast them as generic bullion. No serial numbers, no identifying marks, just pure gold, untraceable. And here's the part that might sound obvious, but almost no one actually realizes it. Once you melt gold down, you can't prove where it came from. Gold is gold. One bar looks like any other bar. And without those identifying marks, Britain had no way to claim ownership. But the British government didn't give up. They launched an international investigation. They pressured other countries. They threatened sanctions against anyone caught trading in stolen British gold. And for a while, it seemed like they might actually recover some of it. In 1919, British agents traced a shipment of gold to a warehouse in Shanghai. They raided it, and they found 17 crates of gold bars. No markings, no serial numbers, but the weight and purity matched British gold exactly. The agents were convinced they'd found part of the missing treasury. But then the Chinese authorities stepped in. They said the gold belonged to a legitimate Chinese trading company, that there was no proof it had been stolen, and that Britain had no jurisdiction in Shanghai. The gold disappeared again. And that's when Britain realized something terrifying. They weren't just fighting Russia. They were fighting a system. See, Lenin had accidentally created something that wouldn't exist officially for decades, a global money laundering network. He'd shown that if you had enough gold and enough connections, you could move wealth anywhere in the world without anyone tracking it. And other countries were paying attention. Criminal organizations, revolutionary movements, even some Western businesses. Everyone saw what Lenin did and thought, we could do that too. The missing British gold became the blueprint for modern financial crime. But here's where the story gets even stranger. Because in 1920, Britain finally got a breakthrough. A former Russian official, someone who worked in the state bank, defected to London, and he brought documents, manifests, transfer orders, railway schedules, everything. He showed British intelligence exactly where the gold went, which trains carried it, which vaults held it, which intermediaries sold it. Britain finally had proof. They took it to the newly formed League of Nations. They demanded international action. They wanted the world to condemn Soviet Russia for theft. And you know what happened? Nothing. See, by 1920, the world had bigger problems. World War I had just ended. Economies were shattered. Governments were broke. And Soviet Russia, despite being isolated, despite being condemned, was offering something nobody else could. Trade deals. Lenin's government had resources, oil, timber, grain, and they were willing to trade with anyone who'd deal with them. So one by one, countries that had supported Britain's claims started backing off. They said things like, well, it's complicated. We need to verify the documents. We can't get involved in bilateral disputes. Translation: we care more about trade than we care about your missing gold. Britain was furious. Their Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, called it the greatest betrayal of international trust in modern history. But he couldn't do anything about it. The gold was gone. The international community didn't care. And Russia had won. Or had they? Here's what most people miss about this story. The gold didn't make Russia rich. Yeah, Lenin used it to fund the Red Army, to buy weapons, to consolidate power. But by the time the Civil War ended in 1922, most of that gold was gone, spent, traded away, converted into currency that got devalued by hyperinflation. The British Empire lost 500 tons of gold, and Russia barely benefited from it. So who won? The intermediaries, the middlemen, the criminal networks that Lenin used to move the gold. They kept their cuts, they built their operations, and they disappeared into the shadows. Some historians think that gold helped fund organized crime networks in Asia for decades. Others believe portions of it are still hidden somewhere, sitting in a vault, waiting. But here's the truly insane part. Britain never officially gave up their claim. Even today, in the 21st century, the British government technically considers that gold to be stolen property. There's a file buried in the National Archives that lists the exact amount. 5,250 crates, 500 tons, serial numbers for every single bar. And if anyone ever found gold matching those specifications, Britain could, in theory, claim it. Of course, they won't, because the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Russia inherited its debts, but also its assets. And no modern government wants to reopen a century-old dispute over gold that's probably been melted and remelted 100 times. But the legal claim exists, and that means something fascinating. Somewhere in Russia, there might be officials who know exactly what happened to that gold. Because here's what we know for sure. Soviet archives were opened briefly in the 1990s. Historians got limited access, and some of them found references to the British gold, not complete records, just fragments, mentions in financial reports, transfer orders that referenced special assets. But enough to confirm that yes, Lenin's government did take the gold. Yes, they moved it. Yes, they sold it. The question is, did they sell all of it, or did they keep some back? Think about it. You're running a new government. You're surrounded by enemies. Your economy is in shambles. Would you really sell every ounce of gold you had, or would you keep an emergency reserve, just in case? Some historians believe that's exactly what happened, that Lenin kept a portion of the British gold as a secret reserve, and that reserve got passed down through Soviet leadership. Stalin might have used it. Khrushchev might have known about it. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, that gold might have been quietly absorbed into the new Russian Federation's reserves. No announcement, no documentation, just gold, sitting in a vault, with no questions asked. Now, most people stop here. They say, okay, so Russia probably kept some gold. That's interesting, but not provable. But what happens next is insane. In 2007, a British historian named Catherine Meredale published a book. She spent years researching Soviet financial records, and she claimed she found evidence of a secret gold reserve, not just from Britain, from multiple countries. See, Britain wasn't the only nation that sent gold to Russia during World War I. France did too. Romania did too. Even the Czech government in exile had sent assets to Russia for safekeeping. Meredale's research suggested that all of that gold, hundreds of tons from multiple countries, had been consolidated into one massive reserve, and that reserve still existed, hidden, documented somewhere in Russian archives, but inaccessible. The Russian government denied everything. They said Meredale's research was speculative, that the archives she referenced didn't exist, that the whole theory was Western propaganda. But here's the thing. They didn't provide any counter-evidence. When a government denies something without providing proof of the denial, that tells you something. They're hiding something. Maybe not the gold itself. Maybe the gold really is gone. But the records, the documentation of what happened to it, that definitely exists. And Russia won't release it. Why? Because even if the gold is gone, even if it was all sold a century ago, the paper trail would be embarrassing. It would show exactly how the Soviet Union violated international law, how they betrayed their allies, how they built their revolutionary state on stolen wealth. And modern Russia doesn't want that story out there. They want to be seen as a successor to a great power, a nation with historical legitimacy, not as the inheritor of history's greatest heist. But here's where the story gets personal. Because this isn't just about governments and gold. There were real people who lost everything in this mess. British investors who bought war bonds, expecting to be repaid from that gold. Russian officials who promised to protect the assets, then watched helplessly as Lenin's agents took them. Families who'd invested their savings in the war effort, only to discover those savings were gone forever. One British soldier, a captain named William Thornhill, had kept a diary throughout the war. In 1919, he wrote, "We fought for Russia. We bled for Russia. And they repaid us with theft." He spent the rest of his life trying to get Parliament to pursue the missing gold. He wrote letters. He organized veteran groups. He testified before committees. Nothing worked. He died in 1954, convinced that his country had abandoned him. And he wasn't wrong, because the British government had made a calculation. Was 500 tons of gold worth souring relations with the Soviet Union forever? Was it worth risking trade? Worth risking diplomacy? They decided it wasn't. And so Thornhill and thousands like him were told to move on, to forget, to accept that sometimes justice doesn't happen. But this next part might sound obvious, but almost no one actually thinks about it. What if the gold wasn't the real treasure? Think about it differently. Lenin didn't just steal gold. He stole trust. He showed the world that international agreements meant nothing if you had the power to ignore them. That debts could be erased. That obligations could be rejected. And that scared the hell out of every government on earth. Because if Russia could do it, who else would try? That's why the League of Nations was created. That's why international law started getting codified. That's why we have treaties and enforcement mechanisms today. All because Lenin stole 500 tons of gold and proved that without enforcement, agreements are just paper. The modern international system was built, in part, as a response to this theft. We have the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the United Nations, all designed to prevent another country from pulling what Lenin pulled. So in a weird way, the missing British gold created the framework for modern global governance. And Russia? They're still living with the consequences. Because here's the thing about stolen wealth. It never truly belongs to you. The Soviet Union collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Its economy couldn't sustain itself. Its people stopped believing in the system. And one of those contradictions was built on that stolen gold. Lenin promised a workers' paradise, but he funded it with theft. He said communism would create a society without exploitation, but he built it by exploiting Britain's trust. That hypocrisy echoed through 70 years of Soviet history. And when the system finally fell, nobody mourned it. Modern Russia inherited that legacy. They inherited the suspicion, the distrust. When Western governments negotiate with Russia today, there's always a question in the back of their minds. Will they honor this agreement? Or will they pull another 1918? That's the real cost of the missing gold. Not the metal, not the money, the trust. So here's where we are today. Britain claims Russia owes them 500 tons of gold. Russia says that debt was erased when the Soviet Union ended. And the truth? It's buried in archives that neither side want to open. But there's one more twist to this story. In 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, Britain threatened sanctions. And one British politician, Lord Howe, gave a speech in Parliament. He said, "Perhaps it's time we reminded Russia of their outstanding debts, including a certain matter of gold from 1918. It was a throwaway line, a historical reference. But the Russian ambassador responded within hours. He said, "If Britain wishes to discuss historical debts, we should start with what the British Empire owes the world." Translation: don't go there. And Britain didn't. Because once you start digging into historical debts, everyone has skeletons. Britain colonized half the world. They extracted resources. They disrupted economies. If we're tallying debts, who owes whom? So the gold remains missing, not because it's physically lost. It probably got melted down a century ago. It remains missing because both sides would rather leave it that way. Britain doesn't want to admit they can't recover it. Russia doesn't want to admit they took it. And the rest of the world has moved on. But here's what the story teaches us. Power isn't about who's right. It's about who can enforce being right. Britain was right. The gold was theirs. Legally, morally, didn't matter. Lenin had the power. He had the vault. He had the guns. And when power and law conflict, power wins. Every single time. That's the real mystery of the missing gold. Not where it went, but why we pretend it matters. 500 tons of gold. The biggest heist in history. And it taught the world a lesson we're still learning. Trust is worth more than gold. And once you lose it, you never fully get it back. Russia got the gold. Britain kept its pride. And both lost something far more valuable. If you found this story fascinating, hit that subscribe button. Because history isn't just about dates and names. It's about power, betrayal, and the moments that changed everything. And there are 1,000 more stories like this one, waiting to be told.